All right, my friends, we are going to get started. Okay? Welcome, everybody, to The Prophets, our class that we'll be taking up the next few weeks, that we're going to be learning together about some of these important characters and important books in the Hebrew Scriptures and the Old Testament. So we'll get into a little more of the outline of the weeks that are to come in a moment. I'll have a few images. Those of you who've been here before know PowerPoint is not my strong suit nor my interest, so I've got some images, though, that we have from the St. John's Bible illuminations that we're going to pull out from some of these books in the hopes that not only we'll get to discuss them a little bit together here, but that it will inspire you to go and look at the volumes yourselves and get yourself ready for that. Jamie, can we turn down a little bit on the volume? I don't know, or maybe the bass is a little bit loud. Let's start with a question, though, that I would like to hear your answers to before I get to talking too much, which is, what is a prophet? Andrew, yes?
I guess someone who can see the future.
Someone who can see the future, yeah. That certainly has elements of that. Ed, yeah? Messenger. Good, yeah? Who else is that? Kelly, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I was going to say, they tell people what God said.
Tell people what God said. Thus saith the Lord, right? And God said, those things like that. And then the prophet starts talking, or God starts talking. Sometimes it's confusing. Who's talking? That's part of what's going on. What else is a prophet?
Well, he's considered kind of a moral arbiter.
A moral arbiter. Excellent. Yeah, very good. Trish.
Somebody that says, like, God's perspective is, if you keep going in this line, this is what's going to happen.
Yes. Very much so, yeah. That's sort of this, again, that sort of moral arbiter, this one who's speaking for God, this messenger of God, and with a forecasting of the future. All of that is wrapped up in this. I think in ancient times, it was more sort of what Andrew started us with, the idea of the prophet as soothsayer, right? The sort of, think of the crystal balls and the big flowy robes and things like that. That's, but around... They were sort of predicting future events. So prophets would be sought out to say, by kings, am I going to win this battle? How's this going to go? What's going to happen in the future? But starting around the 8th century BC, so that's the 700s BC, a new kind of phenomenon starts to emerge, really with the prophet Isaiah, which is one of the reasons that he's first. And that is this idea of sort of prophet as conscience of the people, speaking on behalf of God, or perhaps trying to speak God's truths into the present time. So there's sort of this moral castigation becomes a part of it, and moral castigation directed at rulers for injustices and oppression that is happening, but also to the people amongst whom the prophet is living, so that in order to say, if you keep doing this stuff, it's not going to go well, we're not keeping God's laws, not keeping God's rules, and here's what's going to happen, and that kind of thing. So prophets are not only speaking truth to power, but they do speak truth to power. They're also speaking truth to the people as well. And if you want sort of a little something to hang on to for that, it's one who endeavors to speak eternal truth in time, right? In a particular historical context and place. So that interplay, that meeting point between the historical, or the sort of eternal, fundamental truths that we believe as people of faith, or who study Scripture, and the actual lived-out reality of people in the world, which is always a sticky meeting point, right? Think of Jesus' life as well. Okay. They're often then, because they're speaking these, what can sometimes be hard truths to people who may not want to hear them, often on the fringe of society, and calling people back into right relationship with God if they are listened to, which is a big if in various prophets' lives. So you get warnings and woes, but also, Trish, I will add, some of the most glorious articulations of God's promises and hope and encouragement for the future. So prophets are sometimes, you think of sort of Jeremiah, right? It's sort of like, wag, 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 wag. Yes, that is a part of the prophets, a big part. But as big a part, and something that will be actually illuminated within the various images from the St. John's Bible, which I think is really cool, is that element of hope, of inspiration, of hold on, it's going to get better. Think of the world as it will be when God is fully in control, things like that. So you will see some of that dichotomy today, but through the rest of these 8 weeks. They're never just, condemnation and criticism. There is almost always a note of hope, a note of promise, a note of, this is what we are working towards in there as well. So they have visions of justice, which is a big part of what they do. They are speaking often through elevated speech, through poetic speech, which you may not pick up on because we're not reading this in Hebrew, but if you're reading it in the Bible, or if you look again at the St. John's Bibles, most of the prophecy is set off almost in verse form, not in sort of block prose form. So that's an important distinction to hold, just from a sort of articulation and a presentational aspect of this. Speaking the word of God. And for the prophets themselves, one of the things you'll notice is this is often a challenging, anguishing undertaking. It's not comfortable or fun or easy or enjoyable to be a prophet, so much so that many of them at the outset, or even during, resist the call to be a prophet. And one of the things we'll see in Isaiah, we'll look at in a few minutes, but in other prophets as well, often part of the books of the prophecy, of the prophets, that is not prophecy, is the story of the prophet's call. How did they get into this business? Many of them include a little bit of that, which again is really important because it's not just God's word, it's God's words being spoken in a particular time and place through a particular person. And so who that particular person was and is actually kind of matters to what they're saying and who they're saying it to as well. Some of the things that you'll notice they are outraged against are the perversion of justice, as we said, the exploitation of the poor and the helpless, a sort of general debauchery, misrule, and then also the worship of other gods and cultic practices. Okay, so those are some of the things you're going to hear over and over in many of the different prophets, each with different emphases, depending on who they were. And we will, as we look through some of these books, and as you, I hope, will maybe read some of these books, you start to get a sense of the individual character of each prophet from what they write and how they write it as well. Now, the book of the prophets is the most quoted in the New Testament other than the Psalms, the book of Psalms. And interestingly, they sort of are lined up right next to each other if you look at the Old Testament. But the most frequently quoted verses of Hebrew Scripture in the New Testament are the prophets, other than verses of Psalms that are referred to as well. So in order to understand that better, I gave you a little bit of a handout here. Some of you may remember this from other classes we've had, but this is a little breakdown that you should have gotten that shows you how the Old Testament is laid out, because that's going to matter to how we read these books. So you've got essentially different genres within the Old Testament, right? So you've got narrative, you've got history, you've got poetry, you've got journalistic entries, you've got fables and myths, you've got historical accounts and records, etc. And they're generally broken into the books of the law, the Torah, the books of history, and that talks about the sort of formation and then the sort of rise and fall of the people of Israel once they get into the Promised Land. Then poetry, the writings, as they're often called, and that is the big chunks of those, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and then there's some smaller books in there as well. And then you get the prophets. Interestingly, if you pick up a Hebrew Bible, history and prophets are grouped together. What we call history and prophets are grouped together under just the Nevi'im, the prophet. So Joshua through Esther there, or Joshua through Kings, with those starred ones actually being counted as writings. So the way that a Christian Bible organizes their scriptures in terms of order and stuff is not the same way that the Hebrew scriptures are ordered necessarily. Content, barring some translation issues, is generally the same, but the organization is different. So look at that second column there with me, the prophets. Within the prophets, you have what are called the major prophets and the minor prophets. Major prophets being those names, the books that are longer, bigger, the characters that perhaps have a larger impact on their time and place. So that's Isaiah. That's Jeremiah, also with Lamentations appended in there because he is attributed to have written that. Ezekiel, Daniel, big, loud, beautiful, bold books. Then you get the minor prophets called the 12, if you may have heard of them. So there are 12 prophets. Those books are very short, and their scope is much more limited, not in a value judgment, but in a sort of historical time period judgment. So they're focused on much more specific things, usually. So that's where you get all these names that you may not have heard of, right? Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, interestingly, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and ends with Malachi. All right? So we're going to work our way through we're going to spend this week and next week on Isaiah. Then Jared will give us a couple of weeks on Jeremiah and Lamentations. Then we'll have a week on Ezekiel, Daniel, and then a couple of weeks to split the 12, right? We'll do the first 6, then the second 6, talking about those as well. So that's our outline there. Does this make sense as you look at this? Is this helpful to sort of see it mapped out this way a little bit? Just so you can track, like, where are we in the big book that we're looking through here? A couple of things to keep in mind before we dive in specifically. One is it is always important to keep in mind when reading the Hebrew Bible about the event of what they call the exile. This is the fall of the people of Israel from the promised land, having been conquered by the Babylonians, ultimately and completely, and sent into exile throughout the various other parts of the ancient world. Okay? That happens in 586. A lot of the anxiety of leading up to that, we'll talk about a little bit today. The actual experience of being in exile, and then the return from exile that happens about 70 years later, and the attempt to restore and build back their entire way of life. Because when the Babylonians come in 586, they destroy the temple, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is becoming more and more the central focus for the people of Israel. And so not only do they have to rebuild their physical structures, they have to rebuild their peopleness. And so the prophets, as well as much of the Hebrew Scriptures, are concerned with telling this story about how we were created and called into this special relationship with God through the covenant that then we start breaking and messing up. We get the promised land, we build the temple, but somehow we can't quite figure it out as a people, and ultimately it is viewed either as punishment or retribution for their lack of faith or dishonorable acts or whatever it may be, that the exile comes. That's sort of the explanatory narrative that emerges. And then there's the question in exile, how do we stay who we are even if we're spread apart and don't have a place to gather? And then there's the coming back and saying, well, how exactly should we reorder ourselves to be faithful to what was before? That event is pivotal. So keep that in mind throughout these books of the prophets, because many of them are dealing with it in various ways. Second is, many of these prophecies Christians have pulled forward and used to apply to Jesus Christ, right? These talking about an anointed ruler, a Messiah, etc. Can these prophecies be true if they are not talking about Jesus when Isaiah wrote them, but then can they also still be applied to Jesus later on? We'll talk about that in a second. But the role, how we as Christians pick up and use these prophecies will be a part of how we engage with this text. Because they were written, as we'll find out from the first parts of Isaiah, 700 plus years before the birth of Christ. Was he imagining Christ? Or was he talking about something like Hezekiah, a figure we will talk about later? And if he was talking about Hezekiah, does that mean it cannot actually also apply to Christ as well later on? I don't necessarily think that it disqualifies it, just because he might have thought it was the thing that was going to happen to save them, but actually the thing that happened to save them happened later. So we have to sort of wrestle with that as Christians reading back into the Old Testament, always the way we come back to it. Not in that sense of supersessionism or they were wrong, but in time continued, things evolved, and new things happened. And we believe they applied. or do apply. All right, so before we get to Isaiah himself, questions about the prophets, generally. Is that a little bit of helpful background for you before we jump? Yes, Keith.
I think you answered a question I had. The Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, content-wise, are very similar.
Yes.
But they're organized.
Organized a little bit differently. Yeah, organized a little bit differently. Trish, yeah.
In their lifetime, were they perceived as prophets?
That's a great question. Many of the times, yes. Not all the time, especially as we get to some of the 12, sort of the smaller figures, smaller in the sense of shorter and less celebrated. Yes, but people, you'll hear Isaiah talk about, he was saying these things in that time, and people were either listening or not listening. People are seeking out Jeremiah for advice, or Ezekiel, like that. So yes, they were seen in this role. Not always liked for it, but in it. Great question. All right, Isaiah, we have the frontispiece from the St. John's Bible here for you to meditate on as I give you some information here. The first and greatest, I would say, of the prophets. I think some of my favorite passages in all of the Bible come out of Isaiah. There are 66 chapters, mostly poetry. But here's the first little chink in the armor. There is not just one Isaiah. There was an Isaiah, active in the 8th century BC, writing into a particular time and place and historical people. That Isaiah is credited with pretty much verses or chapters 1 through 39 of Isaiah. There is clearly then a prophet writing in verses 40 and onwards, 40 to 55, who is dealing with the experience of being in exile, which was 150 plus years after Isaiah, son of Amoz, who was working in Judah and Jerusalem in the 8th century. And then from about 56 to 66 is a prophet who very clearly is directing his prophecies to a people who have returned from exile, 80 plus years after the experience of exile. So largely based on content, there are what we call 3 Isaiahs. First Isaiah, second Isaiah, third Isaiah. All right? This is not uncommon in the Bible generally, or in the Old Testament specifically. Remember, this was not a modern time. They didn't have books, right? They had scrolls. People were writing. And they were not necessarily all collected and kept in the same place. There were no copyright laws. There was none of that that we sort of assume is like, well, if someone has written it, that person has written it, even if it's under a nom de plume, right, a sort of pen name. In that time, things were much more fluid. It is apparent, it does seem that 2nd Isaiah and 3rd Isaiah knew what had come before, so that what we call 1st Isaiah, those prophecies existed in some way to be known and then were built upon as circumstances changed, as history evolved. And so were still valued and treasured, but then they were added to and adapted. And so you'll see some references back to earlier chapters in some of those later writings. Frank, question.
When did we become aware that there were 3 different Isaiahs?
I'm not sure exactly when within biblical scholarship it did, but it's a pretty established fact. It's not a sort of like, last year they discovered it. It's been a few generations. The history of biblical scholarship is its own class, but there was a move within the 19th century into more of the historical critical method, the German model, that was looking at the text itself, studying the differences, and saying this doesn't look well. If you remember when Rabbi Panitz gave his talk, or maybe his classes on Genesis, or not Genesis, on the Torah, the different I, E, J, P sources of writing that were then woven together into what we consider the final product. So I don't know exactly, it's a fair question, I don't know exactly when we became aware, like maybe this isn't all the same hand that's writing this, but it becomes pretty clear when you're reading it after a little while, because of what Isaiah actually says in the text. Like, I was around at this time, and then later it's talking about things that are different. Yeah, Randy.
Fairly contemporary
Yeah, I mean, it's a modern discovery. I don't think Augustine was sitting there saying, I think there are 3 Isaiahs. Yeah. Randy?
Yeah, are they celebrated equally, or does one Isaiah have greater value in them?
I'll talk about this in a moment. There is some cohesion and unity to the book, and how that came about is still somewhat of a puzzle. But I think they are celebrated, the book of Isaiah is celebrated. I don't think people spend a lot of time determining, like, well, 1 to 39 are my favorites, 40 to 55 are my favorites. But no, it's a fair question. Yeah. Here, yeah.
Does the name Isaiah have any particular meaning? Because it sounds like it's more like a title or office than a person.
It became that, but I think it's because it started with an Isaiah. So there was an Isaiah who has some sort of historical time and place, who became this prophetic figure, and then developed this sort of line of thinking about things, which was then continued on by these other folks whose names were probably not Isaiah. So I do think there is a person behind this, at least initially. It's not, we'll talk about some other books, or even in the New Testament, some people who are using someone else's name because that person was affiliated with some, they were closer to Jesus than the author was or something. But, that's not what I think is happening here. I think this is a continuation of work that an Isaiah, a prophet in the 8th century BC, started. All right, so let me talk, Norris?
Do we know a lot about how they were received?
How Isaiah was received, so those texts? Well, they held on to him, and they didn't kill him.
Well, I would think that there was, whether they were universally accepted or whether some.
I think it'd be hard to say they were universally accepted, but there was some desire to hold on to these particular prophecies, such that 150 years later, when 2nd Isaiah is sitting there in exile, saying he's reading something that he can use, if you will, to say, let me bring this into the present at that time. So let me talk for a second about the different aspects of it that we allow us to say there is some unity, some at least thematic unity and linguistic unity. Some people say that they think there might have been a final editor who went in and tried to sort of make the whole thing fit together after the fact. It's actually less likely that happened in plenty of other books, kind of like it happened in Genesis. Not so much here, probably scholarly. So that's sort of, people have moved beyond that as an assumption here. There's more of a common theological tradition in which they all lived and worked. And as I said, some of the later sections comment on some of the earlier sections, or sort of update and adapt them. And there's a general movement away from the oracles of judgment, which is pre-exile, that sort of time in Israel. And then within exile and post-exile, you get a little more, a larger balance of the hope, the encouragement, we can do this, guys, it's going to be good, it's going to be okay, keep the faith, keep on keeping on. Other common themes that are going to be really important. The centrality of Jerusalem across all 3. They call this the Zion tradition. God, the great King of heaven and earth, Jerusalem being his home, the meeting point, where God has chosen to dwell. And because God dwelled there and lived there, and thus he would then save it, even from all these external threats. But only, the logic went, if it was morally pure. So that's where the condemnation comes in, from Isaiah to his own people. He said, God loves Jerusalem, this is his place, it's sort of the spot where heaven and earth meet, but we have to make it so that God wants to be here. All right? Second issue. It also produces then that focus on Jerusalem, which emerges, and the temple, which emerges within the prophets, then becomes a really central point that is taken up and utilized within Christianity as well. So you get, in the book of Revelation, the new Jerusalem, the new meeting point of heaven and earth will come together, and that's where God will come and dwell with his people, right? And he shall wipe away every tear, and I will be their God, and they will be their people. It sort of cycles back to that idea of God having come into a spot. That centrality really comes out of the idea of that being so important, is one that is really kind of emerges within the prophets and then taken up and developed over time, over those hundreds of years between Isaiah and the birth of Christ, and then the hundreds of years beyond that. All right? The second thing that becomes important that you'll see in Isaiah is the importance of an anointed ruler, right, who would usher in a new age of justice, righteousness, peace. This Messiah, okay, gets picked up then, and Isaiah introduces it, and then that's obviously picked up and played out over time within the prophets, but then obviously very much so in Christianity, that Christ is here as the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Right? There is one who is to come who will restore the fortunes of Israel and usher in this new reign of peace, prosperity. Everything will be good. All right? That then also leads Isaiah and others to focus, since they were focused on Jerusalem, you have the Davidic line that is emerging out of Jerusalem. Remember, David is the one who wants to build the temple. Solomon ultimately builds it, but David starts the line from the Jerusalem-based kings that then, obviously, it becomes important for Jesus to be a part of. So you see how that ties together as well here. So the centrality of Jerusalem, the anointed ruler coming out of that same line at some point in the history. And then the third thing is the contrast between the people of God and the political machinations in the rulers of the day. So this idea that God's people will survive and will triumph even when all the world's great powers are arrayed against them. That's not just in Isaiah, but it is basically the motivating factor for Isaiah and for many of the other prophets. We can do this because of who we are, or who we have been chosen to be. All right? Okay. I'm taking a deep breath because I'm about to give you some really nerdy background into the context of 1st Isaiah. So are you ready for me? All right. So we're going to bring this out because I don't know that you're going to be able to keep track of it. I probably couldn't. So, 1st Isaiah, chapters 1 to 39, there was a Judean prophet who named Isaiah, son of Amoz, as you can see the first line there, writing in the 700s BC. His initial prophetic vision, which we may get to today, happened in 738 BC. And we know that because he says, in the year that King Uzziah died. Right? You remember that from chapter 6 of Isaiah. We'll look at that in a second. The historical context for the 700s BC in Israel and Judah, okay? What is the world in which Isaiah is working that motivates these prophecies? All right. So there is Israel, right? In 930, it splits into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. You've heard of this, right? Splits. This northern kingdom is known by many names, which is really annoying. It's known as Israel. It is known as Ephraim. And then it's known as... Yeah, those are the two that we need to focus on now. The southern kingdom is known as Judah. And it includes Jerusalem. Okay? So it's got a lot of centrality. The kingdom is much bigger. Don't look at this as not to scale, if you may have guessed. All right. Isaiah is a Jerusalemite in Judah. Okay, so he's southern kingdom. I'm looking at my notes because I want to get this right. And there is from 930 till from year 930 through the 800s into the 700s, a period of relative peace between them. Okay? But in 745, a new king, I'm going to move this out of light here, of Assyria, which is over here, gets a new king, which is a neighboring empire. And he decides he wants to conquer some lands to the west. So Assyria is over east, if you're looking at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, the Holy Land today, Assyria is further over. Exactly where? You can look at a map. There's another, not exactly here, but there's also a empire called Syria and Assyria. Like I said, the names don't help here. So Israel and Syria, so northern kingdom and Syria, decide to join together. And they try to convince Judah to join in with them to resist big Assyria over here. You with me? Judah, King Ahaz, refuses. So he says, no, I don't want to do that. So Israel and Syria attack their southern neighbor, Judah, in the hopes of deposing that king and getting a king who would be more in line with their way of thinking and what they want to do. You with me so far? Meanwhile, Ahaz turns to Assyria for help against the northern kingdom and Syria. And he says, I'm getting attacked by my northern, my brothers and their friends. Will you help me? So Assyria does. And they fend off the attack. So it stays split. But the price that Judah pays to Assyria is very steep. It essentially becomes a vassal state of Assyria at that point. So that's around 745 BC. Do you remember when Isaiah had his vision? Well, 745 is when Assyria starts to want to do this. When is Isaiah's first vision? And remember what I said? 738. Right? So this is the context in which he is working here. In the decades following that war, the Assyrians continue to expand their influence over. Okay? All the while having their little, vassal state here that they can kind of keep under their thumb. They take over Syria. So Syria is no more. It becomes part of Assyria. And then they take over the northern kingdom. And that is in 722. If you've done your biblical scholarship, you remember the fall of the northern kingdom, 722. The fall of Judah is the exile, 586. Okay? So there's a gap there. Now, an Assyrian ruler dies in 705, so 15, 20 years later, right? And Hezekiah is the leader of Judah at that time. I mean, say king, but he's sort of a sub-king underneath the Assyrian Empire. And he is the son of Ahaz, the one who got them into this deal. And he decides, I don't like this deal. I want to rebel against against Assyria. You got me? So he's like, I want to stop being a vassal state. I want to be our own thing again. And Assyria is having a leadership transition. They're weak. He goes for it. To do that, he seeks help from Egypt, which is below, right? He makes overtures to Egypt. He said, I'm going to break free of Assyria, but I need your help. Egypt turns him down. So that means Hezekiah is successful until the new Assyrian king comes into power and retaliates. And then he conquers cities in and around Jerusalem in 701. So the southern kingdom is getting eaten away. And the only thing that saves Jerusalem, that central location, from being conquered in 701, is that Hezekiah agrees to back off and pay a massive tribute, a massive fine to the Assyrians. Okay? This was the political climate during 1st Isaiah's prophetic time, which ran more or less from 738 to 701 or so, until that time when Hezekiah relents. He counseled, you'll see if you read it, and some of our passages will talk about this, but it's very clear if you read the text itself. He counseled first the reliance on Assyria to fend off the northern people. That was one of his sort of prophetic objects that he was prophesying against. He also prophesied against turning to Egypt for help. That didn't really materialize, but when you read him talking about, well, don't go with Egypt, that's not going to go well, that was what he was talking about. So slightly different time within this same general milieu. Okay? He wanted them only to rely on God. And that was what he wanted them to be able to do. Political rulers didn't really think that. I'm going to pause there for a second. Does this make sense? But I mean, do you understand a little bit what's happening here between the larger empires trying to come into the southern empires, alliances that are being formed and broken in that time? That's the Holy Land geopolitical situation. Still happens today in various ways. Frank?
Which of the various governments are considered Babylonian?
They don't come along till later. But that's a great question. So Babylon so this is 700s. In the 600s and then 500s, Babylon's over here, and they start rising even more in the east. They conquer the Assyrians and then keep going. So the Assyrians eventually fall, as all empires do. And then the Babylonians come in, and then they're the ones that ultimately destroy Jerusalem and create the exile. Yeah. Randy, did you have a question? Yeah.
After the payment was made to Assyria, did that buy their independence, or did they?
It didn't really buy their independence, but it did buy their survival. So Jerusalem stays within the hands of the line of Davidic kings, while also working under Assyria. And then again, it goes on for the next 100 years, and there's more that happens, but this is sort of specific to Isaiah himself. So, and that's why when they say the fall of Jerusalem is not until 586 and not until the Babylonians come in and do it, the reason there was a Jerusalem to fall was because it had stayed. Does that make sense? So that is, but then generations removed from exile. So first Isaiah is not necessarily dealing with exile, he's dealing with this mess. And then we have exile, and then we have the return from exile, which is then Babylonian, Cyrus, all that stuff. Okay? Other questions about this mess? Yeah, sure, John.
At this time, remember, these are all small city-states.
Yeah.
And therefore, if you were conquered, your God was stronger than the next guy.
Nice. That's a great point. Yeah.
And so in that process, if you were still able to hold on to your, I'll call it the old God,
Yeah.
it was unusual.
That's fair. No, that's a great point. Yeah, so a lot of the theological assumptions of the day were that these were cultural, religious, political, social conquering. It wasn't just a sort of like, we want more land. These were sort of different worldviews living right on top of each other. Great point. Yes, no, they were more, we would call them tolerant or, permissive of everybody to say, yeah, do what you want. We don't care. Just don't piss us off. Excuse my language. And well, that's what happened. They did, and they suffered for it. But they were allowed, even when the Babylonians were, say, you can keep Jerusalem. And then they were allowed to return. But anyway, so that there is slightly different cultural situations in each context. Okay? Other questions? All right, I'm actually going to pause us there because the next week we're going to jump into Isaiah itself. So next week we're going to be reading passages from Isaiah, and we'll work through some sections from 1st Isaiah, 2nd Isaiah, and 3rd Isaiah. We'll look at some illuminations. There's some beautiful ones coming. If you can remember, this is Isaiah's call to prophecy. We'll talk about that in Isaiah 6. And then this one, which is some of the language that Isaiah is the one who populates about the Messiah. Right? So there's some beautiful things for us to look at and talk about. We'll talk about how those sections in the different chapters are split up. The sort of general topics, we'll read some selections so you can get a sense of what does Isaiah's, a passage of condemnation, which is positioned right next to a passage of salvation. Right, so you can sort of compare and contrast those a little bit. If you're inclined, I would encourage you to read through the book of Isaiah in your own Bible or on, online if you want, this week and next week, sort of spread it out. I think this historical context will actually help make some of it a little bit clearer, and as well as thinking like, do I notice a shift from chapters 39, 1 to 39, and then 40 to 55. Just be warned, within 1 to 39, there are also some sections that may have been interspersed or interpolated in. So 1 to 39 are not necessarily consistent, and those too may have some smaller sections that are like, did Isaiah really write this or why? For example, chapters 36 to 39 are all borrowed from the Deuteronomistic history in 2 Kings about Hezekiah and Ahaz and the king of Assyria, etc. So you'll be reading along, and all of a sudden there'll be this section, you'll be like, what? Why? This feels out of place. It's because it was essentially taken and plugged in, because this is the period of time that Isaiah is talking about and working in. So it's not like a nice, easy read, but I do think it would be helpful, and you'll notice as you go through a lot of passages that you're like, oh yeah, I know this one, as you go into it. All right? So that would be my encouragement for us for today. Final questions. Jennifer, yeah.
Do you have any recommendations if we wanted to do a little bit more on the history here? Just simple for dummies kind of biblical history?
This isn't dummy enough for you. Yeah, no. Yeah, let me think about it. I don't know that I have anything other than just a basic sort of study Bible commentary, which is about the level of understanding I have about all this. Obviously, it goes deeper than that, and there's more to it. But let me see if we can track something down, okay? Yeah. Okay, other questions? So this was all context building for us to dive into the real meat next week, okay? So thank you for your patience, thank you for your attention, and I hope this makes things a little bit more clear as we get into the actual text itself. All right? Thank you, guys. We'll see you in there in a few minutes.